At first light, before the heat begins to shimmer and before the modern city fully wakes, the plateau rises above the western edge of the Nile Valley like a dark shelf of stone. From below, it appears abrupt and deliberate, a high limestone terrace set back from the floodplain, dry beneath an open sky, commanding every approach from the river. The pyramids make the place seem inevitable now, as though no other landscape could have carried them, yet nothing about their presence was inevitable. Before royal surveyors stretched cords across the bedrock, before quarrymen cut the plateau into ramps, pits, and angular scars, this was one elevated margin of the desert overlooking one of the most productive river valleys on Earth. The mystery begins not with how the pyramids were built, but with why this particular rise was chosen to bear them. Seen from the modern desert, Giza can look remote from water. Modern development obscures the older geography. In the 4th millennium and early 3rd millennium BCE, however, the view was different. The Nile did not flow through a single fixed channel with controlled banks. It shifted, divided, flooded, abandoned old courses and created new ones. Marshes, inlets, levees, and seasonally wet ground occupied the lowlands east of the plateau. The base of Giza was therefore not the edge of empty wilderness. It stood beside a living river system, close enough for boats, cargo, and people to approach, yet high enough to remain above the destructive reach of ordinary inundation. This balance between access and elevation was one of the site's quiet strengths. The plateau belonged to the desert, but it faced the river. That position mattered because ancient Egypt depended on contrast. The black soil of the valley fed towns, fields, herds, and the state. The pale western desert offered dryness, visibility, stone, and a landscape associated with burial and the setting sun. Giza occupied the seam between these worlds. From the floodplain, anyone looking west would have seen the escarpment catching the final light of day. From the plateau, the valley spread below in a long green corridor. This was not merely a dramatic view, it was a strategic one. A monument placed here could be seen from river traffic, agricultural land, and routes leading toward the administrative heartland around Memphis. Royal architecture did not need to hide. It needed to dominate the horizon without being cut off from the machinery that sustained it. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, because the closer the landscape is examined, the less Giza resembles an isolated miracle in the sand, and the more it begins to look like the center of a carefully chosen system. The bedrock offered the first practical invitation. The plateau is formed largely from layers of Eocene limestone, laid down when a shallow sea covered this region tens of millions of years before any human settlement existed. Those beds were not uniform. Some layers were denser and stronger, others were softer, fractured, or vulnerable to erosion. From a distance, the surface may appear flat, but it rises, falls, steps, and breaks along natural bedding planes. Such irregularity created difficulties, yet it also provided opportunities. A high, broad expanse of limestone could carry enormous weight. It could be cut and incorporated into foundations. In places, natural rock could even become part of the monument itself, reducing the amount of stone that had to be moved. What survives in the record suggests that the builders did not simply place pyramids on top of the plateau. They read the plateau, adapted to it, and gradually transformed it. This site also contained its own building material. This is easy to overlook because the finished pyramids appear separate from the ground beneath them. In reality, Much of their core stone came from the same geological body on which they stand. Quarrying removed huge volumes of local limestone, leaving hollows and cut faces that later generations sometimes mistook for natural depressions. Stone was taken from nearby ground, trimmed, hauled, and stacked into a more ordered version of the same hill. Giza was not only a foundation, it was a reservoir of mass. The builders found a place where the mountain they intended to create was already present, spread horizontally across the desert, waiting to be reorganized. Yet geology alone cannot explain the choice. Egypt contained many limestone ridges, desert margins, and elevated places. The site had to serve a state, not merely an engineering project. The court required access to labor, food, timber, rope, copper tools, livestock, scribes, boat crews, and administrators. It needed a place connected to royal authority and the transport network of the Nile. Giza lay within the wider necropolis of Memphis, the political center near the head of the delta. Grain could be collected, rations distributed, teams organized, and shipments redirected. The plateau's visibility proclaimed royal power, while its proximity to the river allowed that power to operate. The western escarpment also offered room for temples, causeways, tombs, quarries, workshops, and worker settlements. It allowed future rulers to add their own monuments nearby, extending a royal landscape rather than beginning again elsewhere. This potential may not have been fully understood at the beginning. Scholars still debate how much of Giza's later arrangement was planned from the start, and how much emerged as successive reigns adapted to what earlier builders had left behind. But the plateau gave those decisions space to unfold. Its openness made precise orientation possible. A broad horizon helps observers track the movement of the sun, the changing length of shadows, and the rising and setting positions of stars. The pyramids would eventually be aligned with remarkable accuracy to the cardinal directions. Though no single proposed method has won complete agreement, what matters here is that Giza offered an expansive field of view and enough stable ground for large-scale surveying. The place allowed geometry to be imposed upon geology. It gave royal planners a surface on which earthly construction could be linked, at least symbolically, to a larger cosmic order. The final strength of the plateau was psychological. From below, elevation magnifies size. A pyramid already enormous becomes even more commanding when raised above the valley. The slope hides parts of the construction zone while exposing the finished form. The monument appears not merely to stand on the horizon, but to emerge from it. This effect would have been powerful from boats approaching along the river branches and inlets east of the desert edge. The rising mass of limestone would announce the king's project long before a visitor reached the causeway or temple. So Giza begins as a convergence rather than a single answer. It is high but accessible, dry but close to water, made of workable stone yet strong enough to carry extraordinary loads. It stands near the administrative core of the kingdom while occupying the symbolic west. It offers raw material, open sight lines, and room for expansion. No single explanation fully accounts for the choice, because the choice only becomes convincing when all these conditions are seen together. The plateau was not perfect. It contained fractures, slopes, softer beds, and logistical risks. But it offered something rarer than perfection, a landscape in which engineering, transport, government, ritual, and spectacle could reinforce one another. Long before the pyramids gave Giza its modern identity, the ground had already presented a possibility. The rulers of the Fourth Dynasty would turn that possibility into stone on a scale never seen before. But the plateau itself came first, waiting above the floodplain. facing the river, holding within its surface both the burden and the material of the mountains that were about to rise. Before the first pyramid rose, Giza was already a landscape of edges. To the east, the Nile Valley opened into cultivated ground. Reed beds, channels, and settlements tied to the rhythms of flood and harvest. To the west, the terrain hardened into pale limestone and desert gravel. Between them lay a zone that was neither entirely inhabited nor entirely empty. People crossed it, buried their dead near it, quarried stone from parts of it, and watched the river from its heights. The plateau had not yet become the most famous royal cemetery in history, but it was already connected to the ways ancient Egyptians understood land, death, and authority, thousands of years before Khufu. The climate of northeastern Africa was less arid than it would later become. Earlier in the Holocene, seasonal rains reached farther north. Lakes and temporary watercourses appeared in areas now dry, and human groups moved through grasslands that gradually retreated as the Sahara became more severe. By the 4th millennium BCE, however, Egypt's population was increasingly concentrated along the Nile. The river became not just a source of water, but the organizing structure of society. Villages grew on safer ground. Agriculture became more dependable, and communities learned to use the desert margins for activities that benefited from dryness and distance from the floodplain. Burial was one of those activities. The Nile Valley's cultivated soil was valuable, wet, and repeatedly disturbed by inundation. The desert offered a more stable place for the dead. Its dry sand could preserve bodies and grave goods far better than the damp fields below. Long before stone pyramids, communities placed burials along the western margins of the valley, where the living world of agriculture met the open land beyond. Over time, this simple environmental choice acquired deeper meaning. The west was where the sun disappeared each evening, and it became associated with death, transition, and renewal. The landscape itself encouraged the connection. A person standing in the fields could watch the sun descend behind the desert escarpment, vanishing into the same direction where cemeteries lay. Giza belonged to this wider funerary geography, yet the evidence for its earliest use is not as complete as the later monuments might suggest. The construction of the pyramid complexes transformed enormous areas, removing or burying earlier surfaces, later quarrying, tomb building, erosion, and modern development further disturbed the record. Archaeologists therefore work with fragments rather than a continuous picture. What survives suggests activity before the 4th dynasty, but it does not reveal a large, fully documented settlement spread across the plateau. The absence of such evidence should not be mistaken for absolute emptiness. Ancient landscapes often preserve monumental construction more clearly than temporary shelters. Paths, camps, or small-scale extraction sites. From the plateau, movement along the valley could be observed over a great distance. Boats travelling through nearby channels, herds moving at the edge of cultivation, and people approaching from the Memphis region would have been visible from higher ground. This made Giza useful even before royal architecture transformed it. A raised limestone shelf could serve as a landmark. Its natural escarpment distinguished it from the flatter land below, and its pale surface reflected sunlight differently from the dark alluvial soil. It announced the transition from river country to desert. By the early dynastic period, Egypt had already become a unified kingdom in political terms, though unity was continually reinforced rather than permanently guaranteed. Royal power centered in the Memphis region, where the narrow Nile Valley meets the broad delta. The rulers of the first and second dynasties built major funerary monuments at Abydos and Saqqara, establishing traditions that linked kingship, burial, storage, ritual, and monumental architecture. Saqqara, south of Giza, became one of the central cemeteries of the state. Its mastabas and royal enclosures demonstrated that the Western Desert could be organized into a formal landscape of authority. The Third Dynasty pushed this development further with the step pyramid complex of Djoser. Stone architecture expanded dramatically. Walls, courts, shrines, passages, and the pyramid itself reproduced elements once made from mud brick, timber, reeds, and woven materials. The state learned how to quarry, transport, shape, and place limestone on a scale previously unknown. The step pyramid was not yet the smooth-sided form that would define Giza, but it changed what royal burial could mean. A tomb was no longer merely a protected chamber or a visible mound. It could become an engineered landscape that reorganized the desert around the king. The experiments continued under later rulers, especially Sneferu. At Meidum and Dashur, pyramid builders tested angles, foundations, internal arrangements, casing methods, and the behavior of enormous masses of stone. The bent pyramid still records a major adjustment in slope, while the red pyramid shows a more successful command of the true pyramid form. These projects were not failed preliminaries in a simple march toward perfection. They were functioning royal monuments and enormous technical schools. Surveyors, quarrymen, haulers, masons, administrators, and boat crews carried experience from one site to another. By the time Khufu's planners considered Giza, they inherited decades of lessons about what kind of ground could support a pyramid and what could go wrong when geology was misunderstood. Giza's surface offered visible clues. Natural limestone beds formed terraces and ledges that could be examined before construction began. Fractures revealed how blocks might separate. Softer layers could be removed more easily, while stronger beds offered stable support. Even limited extraction would have shown the character of the rock beneath the surface. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars cannot reconstruct every investigation made by ancient builders. But it's difficult to imagine that the plateau was chosen without extensive testing. A project of this size required more than symbolic enthusiasm. It demanded confidence that the ground would not fail beneath millions of tons of stone. There may also have been earlier quarrying or stone collection in and around the broader area, though later construction has obscured much of the sequence. Limestone from desert margins was used in tombs, walls, tools, and architectural features long before the Great Pyramid. Ancient workers did not encounter Giza as an unknown material. They belonged to a culture already skilled in reading stone. They understood that a cliff face, exposed bed, or fractured ledge could reveal the quality of what lay deeper inside. The plateau's geology was not merely observed from above, it was tested through cutting. The human landscape below was equally important. Villages and administrative centers in the Memphis region supplied a population accustomed to state labor, agricultural taxation, and seasonal organization. During the flood season, when some farming work was reduced, labor could be redirected toward royal projects, though the old image of an entire idle population suddenly becoming pyramid builders is too simple. Construction required permanent specialists as well as rotating crews. It depended on year-round planning, storage, accounting, and transport. Those systems did not appear suddenly at Giza. They had developed through generations of temple building, tomb construction, irrigation management, and royal administration. By the end of Sneferu's reign, the essential pieces were already present: a centralized state, experienced builders, established quarries, organized transport, and a funerary tradition increasingly expressed through stone. Giza entered this story not as untouched wilderness, but as a promising location within a mature political landscape. It stood north of the major pyramid experiments at Dashur, closer to the head of the delta, and highly visible from the river approaches to Memphis. Its plateau was broad enough for an ambitious complex, yet near enough to water and settlement to remain connected to the kingdom's productive core. What Khufu's reign brought was not the invention of pyramid building, royal burial, or desert cemeteries. It brought a decision to concentrate inherited knowledge in a new place. The plateau's earlier traces were absorbed into a project so large that everything before it became difficult to see. Paths disappeared beneath causeways. Surfaces were cut into quarries. Natural shelves became foundations. Areas that may once have seemed marginal were drawn into a single royal design. Giza's earlier human story did not vanish completely, but it was overshadowed by the geometry that followed. The landscape beneath the pyramids was therefore not a blank page. It was a palimpsest of climate, movement, burial, observation, and stone use. The builders selected a place already shaped by natural history and human habit, then erased and rewrote parts of it on a scale almost impossible to reverse. When the first survey lines were stretched across the limestone, they did not mark the beginning of Giza. They marked the moment when an old desert edge was claimed for a new and unprecedented purpose. At the foot of the plateau, the ancient landscape moved. The limestone above seemed permanent, but the lowlands below were shaped by water that changed course across generations. Channels widened, narrowed, split, and filled with sediment. Flood basins appeared where cultivated fields would later spread. Sand advanced from the desert, while silt accumulated from the river. To understand why Giza became possible, it is necessary to replace the modern image of pyramids standing beside dry roads and dense suburbs with an older one, a high desert escarpment overlooking a complex waterscape of river branches, marshes, inlets, embankments, and navigable approaches. The Nile has never been entirely fixed. Before modern dams and flood controls, its annual rise brought water and fertile sediment across the valley floor. The extent of the flood varied from year to year, and its channels migrated over longer periods. Some remained active for centuries before becoming shallower or being abandoned. Others divided around islands and natural levees. People living along the river adapted constantly. They raised settlements on safer ground, maintained canals, opened routes through silted areas, and organized agricultural work around the changing water level. The river was Egypt's great highway, but it was a highway that breathed, shifted, and occasionally refused to follow the expected path. Recent research has strengthened the case that a substantial branch once ran along the western side of the Nile floodplain near many of Egypt's pyramid fields. This vanished waterway, now called the Ahramat Branch, appears to have extended past a long chain of royal cemeteries from the region of Lisht toward Giza. Much of it later disappeared beneath agricultural soil, desert sand, and modern construction. Its course was reconstructed through a combination of radar satellite imagery, topographic evidence, geophysical investigation, and sediment cores. The discovery does not mean that every pyramid was built beside an identical, permanently deep river. Conditions changed across time and place, yet it reveals a broad geographical pattern that had become difficult to see from the modern surface. The pyramid fields were not scattered randomly along the desert. Many stood near the edge of the floodplain, where elevated ground approached an ancient channel. Their causeways often descended eastward from the pyramid temples toward valley structures close to the former watercourse. This pattern suggests a repeated relationship between high desert monuments and low river access. The river branch supplied movement, the escarpment supplied permanence, the causeway connected them. At Giza, a subsidiary water body or inlet appears to have brought navigable water closer to the base of the plateau, often described as the Giza Inlet. It occupied part of the low ground east of the pyramid complexes. Its exact shape and depth likely varied through time, and the evidence remains incomplete because much of the area is now buried beneath the expanding city. Even so, sedimentary and topographic studies indicate that the builders were not working at a distant remove from the Nile. Water could approach the construction zone far more closely than it does today. This changed the scale of what could be attempted. A heavy block moved on a boat places a very different burden on human labour than the same block dragged over many kilometres of dry ground. Local limestone still had to be hauled from quarries on the plateau, but fine white casing stone from Tura, granite from Aswan, timber, copper, food, rope, and other supplies could travel through the river network. Boats linked Giza to distant landscapes. This site drew strength from places hundreds of kilometres away because the Nile turned distance into a navigable corridor. The river also connected the monument to agriculture. Pyramid construction consumed more than stone. Large workforces required bread, beer, fish, meat, vegetables, fuel, clothing, pottery, tools, and replacement equipment. These supplies came from estates, villages, workshops, and administrative centres throughout the kingdom. Grain collected as tax could be loaded onto boats. Livestock could be moved along the valley. Timber from farther north or beyond Egypt could enter the same transport system. The plateau itself was dry and unproductive, but it stood beside one of the richest cultivated zones in the ancient world. Seasonal flooding influenced when and how this system operated. During higher water, boats could reach channels and basins that were inaccessible at lower levels. Cargo could be brought closer to the desert edge, reducing the distance over which it had to be transferred onto sledges or carried by crews. Yet the builders did not simply wait for one exceptional flood and rush an entire monument into existence. Environmental records suggest that a western branch maintained useful water levels during the period of the 4th dynasty. The waterways were part of a sustained logistical landscape, not a brief accident. That landscape required management. Natural channels alone were not always sufficient. Water routes could be cleared, widened, or linked to artificial basins. Embankments could guide movement and protect working areas. Harbours and canals could turn seasonal access into a more reliable system. Scholars still debate the precise form of every basin and channel at Giza, especially where later construction has erased the evidence. But the broader picture is increasingly difficult to dismiss. The pyramid complexes were designed in relation to water. This relationship can be read in their architecture. A pyramid stood at the highest point of the complex. Beside it lay a mortuary temple. A long causeway descended toward the valley. At the lower end stood another temple or monumental structure near the water's edge. Religious processions may have moved along this route, but ritual and transport were not necessarily separate worlds. The same corridor that carried sacred meaning could also organize access between the river and the plateau. Stone, supplies, officials, and ceremonial participants all moved through a landscape whose practical and symbolic functions overlapped. The lower ground would have looked busy and untidy compared with the geometric calm of the finished pyramids. Boats arrived and departed, cargo was unloaded, silt gathered in basins, workers repaired hulls, shaped wood, sharpened tools, and transferred goods. Animals were driven towards storage and preparation areas. Administrators recorded deliveries. Water levels rose against mud brick walls and receded, leaving damp layers behind. Beneath the later city, sediments from this vanished environment still preserve pollen, mineral particles, and traces of human activity. One of the most striking traces is chemical rather than architectural. Sediments from the ancient harbour zone contain elevated concentrations of copper associated with the centuries of pyramid construction. Copper tools were essential to quarrying and woodworking, though they were used with stone hammers and abrasives rather than cutting every material directly through metal alone. Tools had to be cast, hammered, sharpened, repaired, and recycled. Tiny particles entered the surrounding environment. More than 4.5 millennia later, the mud retained a faint record of that labour. The harbour survives not only as a proposed outline on a map, but as contamination left by human hands. The Nile branch eventually declined. Sediment accumulated, channels shifted eastward, and the western waterways became less navigable. Increasing aridity may have encouraged sand to enter abandoned areas. What had once been a zone of boats and wet ground became fields, buried channels, and finally urban neighbourhoods. This transformation helped create the illusion that the pyramids had always stood alone in the desert. Their original connection to the river faded from view, even though the causeways continued pointing toward a waterscape that no longer existed. No single reconstruction can restore every channel exactly as it appeared during Khufu's reign. Waterways are especially difficult archaeological features because they change by their nature. Their banks erode, their beds fill, and later communities reuse the same low ground. But what survives in the record suggests a landscape far more connected than the modern view implies. Giza was not selected despite the distance between desert and river. It was selected because that distance could be bridged. The plateau offered stone and height, while the water below delivered everything the plateau lacked. Between them, causeways descended like controlled lines across the slope. The monumental world above depended on the moving world beneath it. Every polished casing block, every timber beam, every ration jar, and every tool repaired near the harbour belonged to the same system. The pyramids rose from limestone, but the river made their construction possible. The river explains how Giza could be supplied, but water alone does not explain why the monuments rose on this particular shelf of desert. For that, the story returns upward, away from the vanished channels and into the limestone beneath the builder's feet. The plateau appears solid from a distance, a broad pale mass stretching beneath the pyramids, yet its interior is layered, fractured, uneven, and far more complex than the clean geometry placed upon it. The builders did not encounter a single flawless slab. They encountered a geological structure formed over millions of years, and every major decision depended on how well they understood it. Long before the Nile Valley took its present form, this part of Egypt lay beneath a warm, shallow sea. Sediments accumulated on the seabed, including the remains of marine organisms, shells, and fine carbonate material. Over immense spans of time, these deposits hardened into limestone. Later uplift and erosion exposed them as the plateau now called Giza. The resulting stone belongs mainly to Eocene formations, particularly the Mokatam layers that create much of the higher ground, and the Mahdi layers found in other parts of the plateau. These names are modern geological categories, but the differences they describe would have been immediately visible to experienced ancient quarrymen. Some beds are dense, relatively strong, and capable of supporting enormous loads. Others are softer, more porous, or filled with fossils and clay-rich material. Certain layers weather into smooth ledges, while others crumble, crack, or erode into recesses. The plateau is therefore less like a single block and more like a stack of stone sheets, each with its own character. Bedding planes run through the rock where one ancient layer meets another. Vertical and diagonal fractures cut across those beds. Natural terraces mark places where harder limestone resisted erosion, while weaker material receded. These features shaped what could safely be built and where. A pyramid does not distribute its weight like a narrow tower. Its enormous base spreads the load across a wide area, but irregular ground can still create serious problems. Softer zones may compress or decay differently from stronger ones. Open fractures can channel water. Hidden cavities or weathered seams can weaken a foundation. A slight natural slope must be corrected if hundreds of courses of masonry are to rise in controlled alignment. The builders therefore needed more than a large patch of desert. They needed a surface that could be tested, cut, levelled, and trusted. The Great Pyramid's foundation demonstrates how carefully this challenge was approached. The natural bedrock was not removed entirely. Instead, parts of it were cut down, while other portions were incorporated into the lower structure. A bedrock rise remains beneath the pyramid's core, though its exact shape is hidden by the monument. This was an efficient use of the terrain. By allowing natural rock to occupy part of the internal volume, the builders reduced the amount of masonry that had to be quarried, shaped, and moved. At the same time, the pyramid remained anchored directly to the plateau, rather than resting on a deep artificial fill. This technique required confidence in the limestone. The builders had to know where the rock was sound and where it required correction. They could examine exposed beds along the plateau's edges and in preliminary cuts. They could observe how the stone fractured under hammering and how it responded when channels were carved into it. Trial trenches and levelling work would have revealed changes in hardness. No surviving manual explains their geological method, and scholars still debate the exact sequence of site preparation. But the finished foundation preserves the result of close observation. One of the most remarkable details is the precision with which the base was levelled across such a large area. The natural plateau was not perfectly horizontal. High points had to be reduced, low points managed, and the perimeter established with great accuracy. Proposals for the levelling process include the use of water-filled trenches, sighting instruments, reference points, and carefully measured cuts. No single reconstruction has been proven in every detail. What is clear is that the builders were not deceived by the plateau's apparent flatness. They treated the surface as something to be measured and reshaped. The same geological structure affected the later pyramids. Khafra's pyramid stands on higher ground, which helps explain why it can appear nearly as tall as Khufu's, even though the monument itself is smaller. Its builders used the natural rise to increase visual impact. Menkar's pyramid occupies another part of the plateau where the terrain, existing quarries, and earlier construction imposed different constraints. Each royal complex responded to the ground beneath it rather than following an identical template. The layers also influenced the appearance and survival of surrounding monuments. Tomb shafts, chambers, roads, and temple foundations were cut into beds of varying strength. In some places, walls could be carved directly from sound limestone. In others, weaker rock had to be faced with masonry. The Great Sphinx would later provide the most dramatic example of this variation, because its body crosses several geological layers that weather at different rates. That story lies farther ahead, but the principle is already visible at Giza. architecture and geology cannot be separated. The plateau's fractures created both opportunities and risks. Natural cracks could make stone easier to detach, but they could also reduce the strength of a block or foundation. Quarry workers learned to follow bedding planes and use existing weaknesses where useful. Builders had to avoid placing critical loads over unstable zones or compensate through masonry. Some fractures widened over time through temperature changes, salt crystallization, occasional moisture, and erosion. Modern conservation studies continue to examine these weaknesses because the same geology that enabled the monuments also threatens them. The desert climate helped. Giza's elevation kept the major pyramids above ordinary floodwaters, while aridity limited the prolonged saturation that can damage porous limestone. Yet the plateau was never completely protected from water. Rare rainfall could run across the surface and collect in depressions or cracks. Moisture could rise through stone from below. Wind-driven sand abraded exposed faces. The difference between geological strength and permanent invulnerability is important. The plateau was suitable, not indestructible. Its natural terraces also shaped movement across the site. Heavy materials had to be raised from lower ground to construction levels. The existing slope could support ramps and roads, but steep or irregular areas required modification. Causeways crossed the escarpment along selected routes. Work zones developed where the terrain allowed stone to be moved efficiently. The plateau's form therefore influenced not only the final placement of the pyramids, but the temporary infrastructure that made them possible. It may be tempting to imagine royal architects standing on the desert and choosing Giza through a moment of inspiration. The reality was probably slower and more technical. Surveyors would have walked the ground repeatedly. Quarry specialists would have inspected exposed beds. Administrators would have compared the site with earlier pyramid fields. The plateau had to satisfy competing demands: strong rock, workable material, sufficient area, manageable slopes, river access, and symbolic visibility. A site excellent in one respect but poor in another could not support the full project. What survives in the record suggests that Giza passed this test because its imperfections were manageable. The builders did not require geology to be uniform. They required it to be understandable. The visible layers, natural ledges, and exposed faces allowed them to predict how the stone would behave. They could cut away weaker material, exploit stronger beds, and place enormous structures where the foundation offered the greatest confidence. This is the deeper relationship between the pyramids and the plateau. The monuments seem to oppose nature through perfect lines and artificial angles, but they depend completely upon it. Their geometry rests on ancient seabeds. Their foundations follow rock surfaces hidden beneath masonry. Their stability reflects choices made in response to fractures and bedding planes that formed millions of years before Egypt existed. The builders did not conquer the plateau by ignoring its structure. They succeeded because they learned where to yield to it, where to cut it, and where to let the stone itself carry the weight. Once the plateau had passed the test of stone, another question remained. Why move the centre of Royal Pyramid building north at all? Sneferu had already invested enormous resources at Meidum and Dashur, where several monumental projects had trained a generation of builders and established the smooth-sided pyramid as a royal form. Saqqara, meanwhile, possessed deep ritual prestige and lay within the long funerary landscape of Memphis. Khufu inherited functioning traditions, experienced crews, and proven sites. Choosing Giza, therefore, was not the obvious continuation of what came before. It was a deliberate departure. The decision must have taken shape within a court already accustomed to thinking at the scale of kingdoms. A pyramid site was not selected by an architect alone. It involved the king, senior officials, priests, surveyors, quarry specialists, transport administrators, and those responsible for provisioning labour. Each group would have seen the landscape differently. Quarrymen judged the stone. Boat crews considered water access. Priests read the horizon through ritual meaning. Administrators measured distance from storehouses, estates, and the centres of government. The final choice had to satisfy all of them well enough to support a project that would outlast the reign that began it. Khufu's political position mattered. He was not building merely a tomb. He was establishing a statement of kingship visible from the approaches to Memphis and from traffic moving through the northern Nile Valley. Giza stood near the point where the narrow valley opens toward the delta, one of the most strategically important zones in Egypt. Goods from Upper Egypt moved northward through this corridor. Resources from the delta and Mediterranean routes moved southward. The region around Memphis allowed the state to connect both halves of the kingdom, at least in administrative theory, and a royal monument overlooking that network carried political weight. A pyramid at Giza could announce the king before visitors reached the capital's administrative heartland. From boats approaching along western channels, the rising plateau would have framed the monument against open sky. At Dashur, earlier pyramids already marked the southern horizon of the Memphite region. By moving north, Khufu extended the royal cemetery across a broader landscape. His pyramid would not simply stand beside those of his predecessors, it would claim a new visual territory. This may have been important dynastically. Ancient Egyptian kings presented themselves as part of a continuous order, but each reign also needed distinction. Khufu inherited Sneferu's achievements, including at least 2 massive true pyramids at Dashur and the transformed monument at Meidum. To build another large pyramid in the same zone risked remaining physically subordinate to an already crowded landscape of his father's monuments. Giza offered distance without disconnection. It allowed Khufu to honour the established tradition of Western royal burial, while founding a new field dominated by his own project. The scale of the Great Pyramid suggests that distinction was central. Its builders were not merely repeating the Red Pyramid with minor changes. They were attempting a monument larger, more precisely oriented, and more internally ambitious than any constructed before. Such a project benefited from a fresh site where the entire surrounding landscape could be organized around one royal vision. At Giza, causeways, temples, quarries, subsidiary pyramids, mastaba cemeteries, roads, and service areas could be laid out without having to fit between major existing royal structures. Saqqara had prestige, but it was already dense with earlier monuments and burials. Its history may have made it sacred, yet that same history imposed limits. Giza offered a broad plateau with fewer monumental obstacles and a commanding relationship to the river plain. It was near enough to participate in the sacred geography of Memphis, while open enough for Khufu's planners to establish a new centre of gravity. Practical considerations reinforced the political ones. The plateau contained vast quantities of local limestone suitable for the pyramid core. Its higher beds offered a stable foundation. Water access lay below. The distance to Tura, where fine white limestone could be quarried for casing, was manageable through the river network. Giza therefore reduced some of the greatest costs of construction, while preserving access to specialized materials. A royal decision could be symbolically bold and economically rational at the same time. The location also sat within a wider system of estates and labor organization. Royal projects drew supplies from across Egypt, but proximity to Memphis made administration easier. Orders could move between the court, river officials, storage facilities, and the construction zone. Scribes could track deliveries. Crews arriving from different regions could be assigned, fed, and supervised. Boats could unload near the plateau rather than at a distant landing place followed by a long overland haul. Giza's advantage was not that every resource lay nearby, but that many different supply lines could converge there. Religious meaning added another layer. The West was associated with the setting sun and the realm of the dead, making the Western Desert a traditional place for cemeteries. Yet Khufu's monument was not placed randomly in the west. It occupied a horizon visible from the living valley. The king's burial complex stood where the daily movement of the sun could be watched across an unobstructed sky. The pyramid's form itself may have carried solar associations, whether understood as a mound of creation, a stair or ramp of light, or a shape connected to the sun's rays. Egyptian religious ideas were rarely confined to one fixed interpretation, and the evidence does not permit a single simple explanation. Still, the relationship between royal afterlife, sunlight, horizon, and western desert was fundamental. Heliopolis, the major center of solar worship, lay northeast of the Memphite region. Some scholars have proposed that the placement and alignments of Old Kingdom pyramids reflect visual or symbolic relationships with that sacred center. At Giza, geometric lines drawn through parts of the pyramid field have been interpreted as pointing toward Heliopolis. Such proposals are intriguing, but they remain debated. The builders left no text stating that Khufu selected the plateau to create a particular sightline. Geometry can reveal patterns, yet it cannot always prove intention. What can be said with greater confidence is that Giza offered a horizon broad enough for cosmic symbolism to be made architectural. The cardinal directions could be established with exceptional precision. The monument's eastern side faced the rising sun and the river valley, while its western side faced deeper desert. The complex joined movement from east to west, water to stone, cultivation to burial. This arrangement was practical, but it also mirrored a larger Egyptian habit of expressing order through landscape. Khufu's choice may therefore have been powerful precisely because no one factor dominated it. A purely religious site with poor transport would have failed. A perfect quarry far from royal administration would have been inefficient. A river harbour on unstable ground could not carry the monument. Giza brought these needs into workable balance. The site allowed the king to build near Memphis without being confined by older cemeteries to command the northern horizon, while remaining linked to the Nile, and to create a monument that appeared both newly founded and deeply rooted in traditional ideas of death and kingship. Scholars still debate how early the full potential of the plateau was recognized. Khufu's planners may have imagined only one dominant complex, not the later arrangement of three great pyramids. Khafra and Menkaure would transform the site further, adapting their own monuments to the terrain and to Khufu's overwhelming presence. The famous composition visible today emerged across several reigns, not from a single master plan proven in advance. But the first choice made everything else possible. By looking north from the established pyramid fields, Khufu's court found a place where a new dynasty could write itself into the horizon. The plateau offered enough distance to create something unprecedented and enough connection to make that ambition practical. Giza was close to the machinery of the state, close to water, close to stone, and open to the sky. In that convergence, Khufu could build not merely another royal tomb, but the monument by which his reign, and eventually the entire age of the pyramids, would be remembered. Khufu's decision placed the project on a commanding plateau, but the monument's final power came from something subtler than height alone. The builders did not treat Giza as a blank level platform upon which an artificial mountain could simply be assembled. They used the natural rise itself. The Great Pyramid was made to appear larger, more stable, and more complete because part of its mass already existed in the bedrock beneath it. What looked from the valley like a structure lifted entirely by human hands was, in part, an ancient hill reshaped, enclosed, and given perfect geometry. The plateau slopes unevenly, rising in places and falling away in others. Selecting the exact position of the pyramid required a careful reading of those contours. A site too close to the escarpment risked weak edges and restricted working space. A site too far inland would lose some of the visual dominance created by the drop toward the floodplain. The builders needed a broad area of sound limestone, room for temples and cemeteries, access to nearby quarries, and a line of approach from the river below. Khufu's pyramid occupies a position that balances these demands. It stands high enough to command the eastern view, yet far enough from the cliff edge to rest securely on the plateau. Once that position had been selected, surveyors faced an extraordinary task. They had to establish a square more than 200 meters on each side across ground that was neither flat nor smooth. Natural ridges, weathered hollows, fractures, and exposed bedding planes interrupted the surface. The base had to be oriented almost exactly to the cardinal directions, and its corners had to meet with remarkable precision. Any serious error made at ground level would multiply as the sides rose toward the apex. The surviving monument shows that the builders created a controlled perimeter while leaving part of the natural bedrock inside it. Around the edges, stone was cut down and prepared to support the lowest masonry courses. Toward the center, a natural rock mass was allowed to remain, becoming an invisible core beneath the structure. Its exact shape cannot be mapped completely because millions of tons of masonry cover it, but passages cut through the pyramid reveal that the bedrock rises within the lower body. The builders, therefore, did not begin from a perfectly cleared platform. They began by deciding which parts of the plateau needed to be removed and which parts could become part of the pyramid. This saved an immense amount of labor. Every cubic meter of natural rock left in place represented stone that did not need to be quarried, hauled, lifted, and positioned. Even a modest bedrock rise occupying the central area could replace thousands of blocks. The technique did not make the project easy, but it made the scale more rational. The Great Pyramid was still an unprecedented construction, yet it was not created through unnecessary effort. The builders exploited every advantage the landscape offered. The natural rise also improved stability. Bedrock could support the internal mass directly, reducing reliance on layers of loose fill. The lowest courses were tied closely to the plateau, and sections of the substructure were cut into the rock itself. The descending passage enters the bedrock beneath the pyramid and leads toward the subterranean chamber. This design physically links the monument's interior to the ground from which it rises. The pyramid does not merely sit on the desert. Its deepest architecture penetrates it. How the surveyors leveled such a vast base remains debated. One proposal suggests that shallow channels were cut and filled with water, allowing the waterline to provide a horizontal reference. Another envisions a network of sighting points established with simple leveling instruments, cords, and repeated measurements. It is also possible that several methods were used together. The builders may have leveled only the perimeter strips beneath the casing rather than reducing the entire interior surface to one plane. This would have been sufficient to establish the visible base while preserving the natural rock inside. Whatever the method, the work required disciplined repetition. Measurements had to be checked from multiple directions. Corners had to remain square. Reference lines had to survive the movement of workers, sledges, stone fragments, and quarry debris. Survey marks could be lost if the surface was cut too aggressively. The construction zone was not a silent geometric diagram, but a crowded landscape of extraction and transport. Maintaining precision under those conditions was one of the project's less visible achievements. The elevation of the plateau amplified everything that followed. From the valley, the viewer did not see the pyramid against level ground. The eye combined the height of the escarpment with the height of the monument. The Great Pyramid's summit stood far above the river landscape, and its pale casing would have caught sunlight before much of the ground below. At dawn and late afternoon, the structure's surfaces changed in brightness, while the plateau beneath it fell into shadow. The natural landform acted like a pedestal, though it was too broad to be recognized as one. The builders also used slope to control approach. A person arriving from the eastern lowlands encountered the pyramid gradually. The monument appeared above the plateau edge before its base became visible. As the approach continued, the causeway drew movement upward toward the mortuary complex. This sequence increased the sense of scale. The pyramid seemed first to hover beyond the escarpment, then to reveal its full mass only as the visitor climbed toward it. Such visual effects did not require modern theories of perspective. Builders accustomed to placing monuments on desert margins would have understood that elevation changes how architecture is perceived. Earlier pyramids at Saqqara, Meidum, and Darsha had already demonstrated the power of raised ground and open horizons. At Giza, those lessons were pushed further. The natural rise became part of the royal image. This relationship between contour and monument continued across the plateau. Khafra's pyramid was positioned on ground slightly higher than Khufu's. Although it is smaller, its elevated base and steeper surviving profile allow it to compete visually with the Great Pyramid from many viewpoints. The effect has sometimes led observers to assume that Khafra's monument is the taller of the two. The builders used topography to negotiate with an already dominant neighbour. They could not exceed Khufu's pyramid easily in volume, but they could make the land help close the difference. The plateau's contours also shaped the surrounding cemeteries. Mastaba fields were laid out on flatter zones near the Great Pyramid, creating ordered rows around the king. Roads passed through natural depressions or cut across raised beds. Quarry areas occupied ground where limestone could be removed without undermining essential structures. The site became an interaction between geometric planning and inherited terrain. Straight lines were imposed where possible, while the broader system bent around geological realities. There were limits to this adaptation. The plateau could not be reshaped without consequence. Quarrying created cliffs and pits. Roads had to negotiate changing levels. Soft layers required additional masonry. Natural fractures could not always be predicted from the surface. The evidence remains incomplete regarding the sequence in which levelling, quarrying, and foundation work occurred, yet the surviving arrangement shows that the builders were not attempting to erase every irregularity. They were converting selected irregularities into advantages. This is one of Giza's quietest technical secrets. The monument's apparent simplicity hides a complex partnership with the ground. The Great Pyramid seems to be a pure form, detached from nature, but its base follows decisions made in response to natural rock. Its interior includes the plateau. Its commanding height depends partly on the elevation beneath it. Its construction was made more efficient by leaving stone where geology had already placed it. The result is a structure that appears to have created its own landscape, even though the landscape helped create the structure. The builders did not raise an artificial mountain from nothing. They found a natural rise above the Nile, measured it, cut it, wrapped it in masonry, and extended its summit into the sky. Giza's monumentality begins there, in the transformation of existing ground into architecture so complete that the original hill almost disappears from view. If the plateau helped carry the Great Pyramid, it also supplied much of the stone from which that pyramid was made. This is one of the most important reasons Giza worked so well as a construction site. The builders did not need to bring every block from distant quarries. For the vast core of Khufu's monument, they could cut limestone almost beside the rising structure itself. The quarry was not a separate industrial landscape hidden far away. It was part of the same plateau, carved into the ground south of the pyramid and gradually absorbed into the architecture of the site. The main quarry associated with the Great Pyramid lies in a broad horseshoe-shaped depression south of Khufu's monument, near the later causeway of Khufu. Its cut faces and surviving contours reveal that enormous quantities of limestone were removed there. The orientation of the quarry follows the same general cardinal order imposed on the pyramid, suggesting that extraction was coordinated with the construction zone. Rather than opening random pits wherever stone was accessible, the builders organized quarrying so that the movement of blocks, waste, workers, and transport routes could be controlled. This local stone was not the brilliant white limestone once visible on the outer surfaces. It was generally rougher, more fossil-rich, and less uniform than the fine casing stone brought from Tura on the eastern side of the Nile. But for the core, it was ideal. It was available in immense volume, could be cut along natural bedding planes, and did not have to travel far. Expensive. High-quality stone was reserved for the areas where smooth finish, close joints, and appearance mattered most. Local stone supplied the hidden mass. The scale of the quarry is difficult to grasp because later construction, erosion, and debris have softened its form. Yet volume estimates indicate that the depression could have provided a large proportion of the material required for Khufu's pyramid. Millions of tons of limestone did not arrive from one distant source. Much of that mass was removed from the plateau itself, shifted over relatively short distances, and stacked into the monument. Stone disappeared from one part of Giza and reappeared in another as ordered masonry. Extraction left deep cuts, stepped faces, spoil heaps, working floors, and transport corridors. Quarrymen followed stronger beds, bypassed poor quality zones, and exploited fractures where the rock separated more easily. Softer material could be removed with stone pounders, copper tools, wooden levers, and abrasion. Harder layers required more effort and more careful planning. The surviving quarry faces show that workers understood how to read the limestone as a layered resource. A block did not emerge from the ground ready to place. Quarry crews first marked its boundaries, cut channels around it, and separated it from the underlying bed. Stone pounders made from harder rock could break and bruise the limestone. Copper chisels and adze were used in tasks suited to their strength, especially trimming softer stone and working wood used in transport. Wooden wedges may have helped in some contexts, though their exact role at Giza remains debated. Once detached, the block was roughly dressed near the quarry, reducing unnecessary weight before hauling. The quarry floor became a place of constant noise and dust. Teams worked along stepped faces while other crews cleared debris. Broken fragments accumulated in heaps or were reused as fill. Sledges moved along prepared paths toward the pyramid. Water may have been applied to the ground to reduce friction on certain routes, a technique supported by later Egyptian imagery and experimental work, though the exact conditions at Giza are still discussed. The main advantage remained distance. Every metre avoided in transport saved effort multiplied across thousands of blocks. The quarry's position south of Khufu's pyramid was particularly useful. Blocks could be moved northward and upward without crossing the lower floodplain. Temporary ramps, roads, and staging areas likely changed as the pyramid rose. Early in construction, material could approach the lower courses directly. Later, the lifting system had to deliver stone to increasing heights. Scholars still debate the precise form of the ramps, whether straight, zigzagging, wrapping, internal, or combined in several stages. The quarry evidence does not settle that question, but it clarifies where much of the stone began its journey. Not all limestone on the plateau was equally useful. Some layers were too fractured, soft, or irregular for major structural blocks. Poorer stone might serve in packing, ramps, or less demanding masonry. Better beds were reserved for larger core blocks. The builders did not pursue uniform perfection in areas that would later be concealed. They worked with categories of material and assigned each to an appropriate role. This practical flexibility is visible in the pyramid core. Many internal blocks are not finely finished on every side. Their joints vary, and packing material appears where exact fitting was unnecessary. The smooth precision associated with the Great Pyramid belongs especially to its casing, passages, chambers, and selected structural zones. The hidden core was built for mass and stability. That distinction allowed construction to proceed at immense scale without requiring every stone to meet the same standard. Special materials still had to come from farther away. Fine white limestone from Tura crossed the river by boat. Granite from Aswan travelled hundreds of kilometres north for chambers, beams, portcullises, and elements that demanded unusual strength or symbolic value. Basalt was used in parts of temple floors. Timber and copper arrived through broader supply networks. Giza's local quarry did not eliminate long-distance transport, but it reduced it to the materials for which distance was justified. The quarry also shaped later monuments. Once Khufu's project had removed a vast section of rock, Khafra's planners inherited a landscape already cut by extraction. His causeway crossed near parts of the quarry zone, and later structures had to respond to the voids and cliffs left behind. Each king built not only on natural geology, but on the industrial aftermath of earlier reigns. One lesser-known consequence is that quarry scars can preserve planning information. Cut faces reveal the direction in which workers advanced. Unremoved ridges show where stone quality changed or where roots were preserved. Alignment between quarry edges and monument axes suggests that extraction and construction belong to one coordinated survey system. The empty space is therefore evidence. What was taken away can be as informative as what remains. Over time, these industrial scars lost their clarity. Sand entered depressions, debris buried working surfaces, tombs and roads reused parts of the area. Modern visitors tend to focus upward and overlook the excavated ground around the pyramids. Yet without those negative spaces, the monuments could not exist. The pyramid is the visible half of a geological transfer, while the quarry is the missing half. No single quarry provided every core block, and scholars continue to refine estimates of how much material came from each zone. Some stone may have been extracted from foundation cuts, nearby ledges, or other parts of the plateau. But the main principle is secure Giza offered an extraordinary concentration of usable limestone directly beside the building site. This transformed the economics of monument construction. The Great Pyramid seems to have been assembled from an almost unimaginable movement of stone across Egypt. In reality, much of its bulk travelled only a short distance. The greater journey was vertical rather than horizontal. Stone left the ground, crossed the plateau, and rose course by course into a new form. The builders did not carry a mountain to Giza. They carved one out of Giza, leaving behind a hollow landscape and raising its missing mass into the sky. The stone had been chosen, the ground tested, and the quarry opened. But none of that determined which way the pyramid would face. Orientation belonged to a different order of problem. The builders had to take a rough, irregular plateau and establish upon it 4 straight sides aligned almost exactly with north, south, east, and west. They had no satellite image, no magnetic compass in the modern sense, and no surviving technical manual to explain the method. Yet the result was so precise that the Great Pyramid's sides deviate only slightly from the true cardinal directions. This precision was not decorative. The pyramid's orientation organized everything around it: temples, subsidiary pyramids, mastaba cemeteries, causeways, and processional routes all responded to the monument's axis. Once the first lines were fixed, the rest of the complex inherited their order. A small error at the beginning would not remain small. It would distort the base, shift the corners, and affect the relationship between the pyramid and every structure attached to it. The plateau's broad horizon made this possible. From Giza, the eastern and western skies opened across the Nile Valley, while the northern horizon remained relatively unobstructed. Surveyors could observe the movement of celestial bodies over repeated nights and seasons. The sun traced different paths across the year. Stars circled the northern sky, shadows shortened, lengthened, and changed direction through the day. The builders had several possible natural references, and scholars still debate which one they trusted most. One proposal centers on the sun. By observing sunrise or sunset at specific times of year, surveyors could establish an east-west line and then construct a perpendicular north-south axis. Another method may have used the shadow of a vertical rod, marking equal shadow lengths before and after midday to identify a line running roughly east to west. Repeated observations could improve accuracy, though atmospheric haze, uneven ground, and seasonal variation introduced complications. A second group of theories looks northward. Certain stars near the celestial pole appear to rotate around a fixed region of the sky. In the 3rd millennium BCE, the identity of the pole star differed from today because Earth's axis slowly changes direction over thousands of years. Observers could still use pairs of circumpolar stars, noting moments when they appeared vertically aligned or crossed a chosen reference. Some researchers have suggested that slight changes in the orientation of different Old Kingdom pyramids may reflect the gradual shift of the stellar sky over time. This is an elegant idea, but it remains a reconstruction rather than a recorded procedure. No surviving inscription states that Khufu's surveyors used one particular pair of stars. The observed deviations are small enough to support several methods, and later measurements may have been affected by damage, missing casing stones, and uncertainty over the original corner positions. What survives in the record suggests careful astronomical observation, but no single explanation fully accounts for every pyramid. The work likely combined observation with geometry. An initial direction, whether derived from sun or stars, had to be transferred to the ground. Surveyors used cords, sighting tools, plumb lines, stakes, and repeated measurements. They could extend a short, accurate line over greater distance by establishing intermediate points. Right angles could be checked through measured triangles and diagonals. Opposite sides could be compared until the square closed with minimal discrepancy. This process required a stable reference surface. The natural rock was uneven, so the builders may have established lines along prepared perimeter strips rather than across the untouched interior. Trenches, cut marks, sockets, and levelling areas around the pyramid have been interpreted as parts of this surveying process, though not every feature is understood. The geometry visible in the completed monument may conceal many temporary marks that were later cut away or buried beneath masonry. The orientation also had practical benefits. Cardinal alignment simplified planning. A square aligned to fixed directions created a stable framework for organizing work crews, delivery routes, storage zones, and neighboring tombs. Measurements could be repeated from a common baseline. Builders working on different sides of the monument could coordinate without relying only on local judgment. Order in the sky became order on the construction site. Yet the symbolic importance was at least as powerful. Ancient Egyptian kingship was deeply connected to Mat, the principle of balance, rightness, and cosmic order. A pyramid aligned to the four directions did more than stand straight. It placed the king's monument within a universe imagined as structured and recurring. East held the rising sun and renewal. West held sunset, burial, and the realm beyond ordinary life. North was associated with the imperishable stars that never disappeared below the horizon. South pointed toward the Nile Valley and the older heartlands of Upper Egypt. The Great Pyramid therefore joined several sacred geographies at once. Its eastern temple faced the river and sunrise. Its western side opened toward the deeper desert. Its northern face contained the original entrance, while internal passages inclined through the stone in directions that later observers have tried to connect with particular stars. Some of those proposed stellar associations remain debated, especially because small changes in date or construction angle can alter the result. Still, the broader intention to place the monument within a cosmic frame is difficult to separate from its precise orientation. One lesser-known feature of the Giza pyramids is that their cardinal errors are not identical. Khufu's and Khafra's monuments show very small but measurable differences, while Menkaura's is less exact. This may reflect changing methods, shorter construction schedules, different survey conditions, or the cumulative difficulty of fitting later projects into an already transformed plateau. It reminds us that precision was achieved by people, not by an abstract machine. Their results were extraordinary, but not magically perfect. The plateau itself may have aided observation. Its height lifted surveyors above some of the haze and obstacles of the floodplain. A wide, relatively open working area allowed long sight lines. Natural ridges could serve as elevated stations. At the same time, dust, wind, heat shimmer, and seasonal weather would have made repeated checks necessary. The final alignment was probably not the result of one ceremonial night, but of a disciplined sequence of observation, correction, and verification. As the pyramid rose, its orientation became visible in light. Dawn struck the eastern face. Evening darkened the western side. At different seasons, shadows extended across the plateau in changing patterns. The monument acted as a vast fixed object within a moving sky. Its geometry made those cycles legible without needing to function as a precise calendar in the modern sense. Popular theories sometimes claim hidden mathematical codes, lost technologies, or impossible astronomical knowledge. The evidence does not require them. Careful observation, simple instruments, patient repetition, and an experienced surveying tradition are enough to explain the basic achievement. The mystery lies not in supernatural precision, but in the organizational discipline needed to preserve accuracy across a noisy, crowded, rapidly changing construction site. By aligning the pyramid to the cardinal directions, the builders transformed the plateau from a natural surface into a measured world. The quarry, harbour, roads, and labour settlements belonged to the practical landscape. But the great square fixed on the bedrock belonged equally to an imagined cosmic one. Giza was chosen because it offered both. It could support a monument physically, and it could frame that monument against a horizon broad enough for the king's afterlife to be expressed in stone, sunlight, and the slow turning of the northern stars. The great square on the plateau fixed the monument to the cardinal directions, but the project could not survive on geometry alone. Every day, food, timber, stone, tools, pottery, rope, animals, officials, and labourers had to move toward Giza in quantities that no desert road could easily sustain. The lower landscape therefore became as important as the pyramid itself. At the edge of the floodplain, where water approached the foot of the plateau, the builders created or adapted a network of harbours, basins, canals, landing places, and controlled routes that allowed the river to reach into the heart of the construction system. The modern visitor sees roads, buildings, traffic, and cultivated ground pressed close to the monument zone. In Khufu's time, much of that area looked different. Low-lying land east of the plateau contained channels connected to the Nile, flood basins, marshy margins, and firmer levees suitable for structures. Water levels changed through the year, and no harbour would have appeared exactly the same in every season. During higher Nile stages, boats could move farther into shallow branches and artificial cuts. During lower stages, some routes narrowed or became difficult. The system had to work with the river's rhythm rather than against it. Reconstructing this vanished topography has required evidence from beneath the modern surface. Sediment cores reveal alternating layers of river mud, sand, organic material, and human disturbance. Pollen shows which kinds of plants grew nearby and whether the area was dominated by open water, marsh, cultivation, or drier ground. Grain size helps distinguish fast-moving channels from quiet basins. Archaeological remains indicate where walls, embankments, or monumental structures once interrupted the natural floodplain. Together, these clues suggest that a substantial harbour environment existed below Giza during the pyramid building period. One reconstruction places Khufu's harbour near the lower end of his causeway, where a protected basin could receive boats arriving from the wider river system. The exact boundaries remain uncertain because later development has buried or destroyed much of the evidence. Yet the broader arrangement is convincing. Water approached the eastern side of the complex. Cargo was unloaded near monumental architecture. A causeway then rose from the low ground toward the pyramid temple above. This sequence is often imagined as purely ceremonial valley temple, causeway, mortuary temple, pyramid. Ritual processions certainly mattered, especially after the king's burial, when offerings and priests maintained the royal cult. But during construction, the same route had a practical life. The lower complex could receive people and materials. The causeway corridor could help control movement up the slope. Temple zones may have served administrative and storage functions alongside ceremonial ones. Ancient architecture rarely separated religion, government, and logistics as cleanly as modern categories do. Stone from Tura illustrates how this system worked. Fine white limestone was quarried east of the Nile, where high-quality beds produced the smooth casing that once covered the Great Pyramid. Blocks were cut, shaped to a useful degree near the quarry, and loaded onto boats. From there, they travelled through the river network toward Giza. The diary of Mera, an official responsible for a transport crew late in Khufu's reign, records journeys carrying limestone to Akhet Khufu, the king's pyramid complex. His account does not describe every stage of construction, but it gives a direct glimpse of organised river transport moving valuable stone toward the monument. Mera's crew worked according to a schedule measured in days. They travelled between quarry areas, waterways, administrative stops, and the pyramid zone. Their movements reveal a system already functioning with regularity. Boats did not simply drift north and search for a place to unload. Routes, destinations, officials, and work assignments were known. The harbour at Giza belonged to a kingdom-wide network of extraction and delivery. Other materials followed similar paths. Granite from Aswan travelled much farther, moving north from the southern reaches of Egypt. Timber entered from regions where large trees were available, including imported sources beyond the Nile Valley. Copper arrived as raw material or finished tools. Food came from estates and settlements across the country. The harbour did not serve one type of cargo. It acted as a transfer point between river transport and the specialised world of the construction site. Unloading demanded organisation. Heavy blocks had to be moved from boats without damaging vessels or losing control near the water. Ramps, reinforced banks, wooden supports, ropes, sledges, and coordinated teams may have been used depending on the cargo. Smaller goods could be carried in baskets or jars. Animals could be driven from landing areas toward holding zones. Administrators needed space to inspect and record deliveries. Delays at the harbour could disrupt work on the plateau, so circulation mattered. The harbour landscape also required maintenance. Silt entered basins during floods. Channels became shallow. Banks eroded. Reeds and aquatic plants could obstruct narrow routes. Workers likely cleared access paths, repaired embankments, and adjusted landing places as water levels changed. The evidence remains incomplete, but no large harbour system could function for decades without repeated intervention. The waterways of Giza were partly natural and partly managed. Research into the ancient topography suggests that water levels during Khufu's reign may have been higher than some earlier models assumed. A higher harbour surface would have allowed boats to approach closer to the plateau and reduce the vertical distance between unloading areas and the beginning of the causeway route. Even a few metres made a major difference when thousands of heavy deliveries were involved. The builders did not eliminate the climb to the plateau, but they shortened and controlled it. Different royal complexes appear to have interacted with the waterscape in different ways. Khafra's Valley Temple and the Sphinx complex stood near a broad low corridor that may have been connected to a canal or harbour zone. Menkaur's complex farther south had its own relationship with basins and lower access routes. The exact chronology of these waterways is difficult to reconstruct because channels shifted and each reign modified what came before. Still, the repeated pattern of descending causeways ending near former water access is unlikely to be accidental. The harbour was also a place where the invisible workforce left traces. Sediments from the ancient basin contain unusually high levels of copper dating to the centuries of pyramid construction. This contamination likely came from the manufacture, use, sharpening, and recycling of copper tools. Tiny particles washed from workshops or working areas into wet sediment, where they remained long after buildings disappeared. The result is a chemical record of labour preserved beneath mud. That detail transforms the harbour from an abstract feature into a human environment. Somewhere near the water, toolmakers heated metal, hammered edges, repaired worn implements, and returned them to crews working in quarries, carpentry areas, or masonry yards. Boats arrived with cargo and left with empty space or return loads. Scribes tracked movement. Workers ate, waited, argued over assignments, and watched the water level. The monument above was serene only when finished. The harbour below was active, crowded, and constantly changing. No complete map survives, and scholars still debate the shape of individual basins, the degree of artificial canal cutting, and the exact function of some valley structures. It would be misleading to imagine a modern stone quay with permanently deep water and fixed docks. Giza's harbour system was adapted to a seasonal river, built from combinations of natural channels, managed inlets, mud brick boundaries, embankments, and working surfaces that could be repaired or abandoned. Its importance lies in the system it made possible. The Nile carried bulk goods over long distances with far less effort than land transport. The inlet brought those goods close to the plateau. The harbour transferred them from boat to shore. Roads and causeways raised them toward the construction zone. Storage areas held them until needed. Administrators directed them toward specific crews. Each stage reduced uncertainty. The pyramids therefore did not stand at the end of a single road through the desert. They stood above a layered transport landscape. River branches gathered resources from across Egypt. Harbours concentrated them. Causeways guided them upward. The plateau converted them into architecture. Giza was chosen because these movements could meet there, at the exact place where water surrendered its cargo to stone. Above the harbour, beyond the routes where cargo left the water and began its climb toward the plateau, another landscape sustained the pyramids. It was not made of polished casing stone or aligned to the horizon with royal precision. It contained ovens, storage rooms, workyards, sleeping quarters, animal bones, broken pottery, administrative seals, and the ordinary debris of people whose labour turned plans into monuments. South of the Sphinx and east of the main quarry zone, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of a settlement often associated with the pyramid builders. Its walls are lower than the monuments it helped create, but its evidence answers one of Giza's most important questions. How could a state keep thousands of workers supplied, organised, and working for decades? The old image of pyramid construction imagined masses of enslaved people driven across the desert under constant threat. The surviving settlement tells a more complicated story. Giza's workforce included permanent specialists, rotating labour crews, administrators, craftsmen, transport workers, food producers, and supervisors. Some may have come from royal estates or provincial communities for limited periods. Others likely lived near the project for much longer. Their work was demanding and highly controlled, but it belonged to an organised state system rather than a single undifferentiated population of captives. The settlement lay in a carefully chosen position. It was close enough to the plateau for workers and supplies to reach the construction areas, yet below the main royal monuments and separated from sacred zones. The harbour and waterways lay within reach. Quarries, workshops, roads, and storage areas could be connected without placing the entire support population directly beside the pyramid. Giza's landscape therefore developed vertically. The king's monument occupied the high ground. The logistical and residential systems spread through lower zones. Causeways and roads moved between them. Excavated areas reveal large architectural compounds, galleries, bakeries, administrative buildings, workshops, and spaces where animals were processed for food. One part of the settlement contains long rectangular structures, often called galleries. Their exact function remains debated. They may have housed rotating crews, served as storage or work areas, or combined several uses over time. The buildings were substantial enough to suggest formal planning rather than a temporary camp of tents and improvised shelters. This distinction matters. Pyramid construction continued across seasons and reigns. A workforce of such scale could not be managed through daily improvisation. People needed assigned sleeping areas, access to water, regular meals, medical attention, tools, clothing, and predictable chains of authority. Supplies had to arrive before they were consumed. Waste had to be removed. Animals had to be kept, slaughtered, and distributed. Pottery had to be produced or delivered in enormous quantities. The settlement was not an accidental collection of huts. It was part of the monument-building machine. Bread and beer formed the foundation of the ration system. Both were staples of Egyptian life and efficient ways to convert grain into food that could be stored, transported, and distributed. Excavations have uncovered large baking installations, including ovens, moulds, ash, and production areas capable of feeding many people. Brewing also required grain, water, fermentation vessels, storage jars, and skilled workers. These were not minor domestic activities repeated casually in every household. At Giza, food production reached an industrial scale. The bread was likely dense and varied in quality, depending on the grain, grinding, and preparation method. Stone-ground flour could contain small mineral fragments introduced during milling, contributing to dental wear among ancient Egyptians. Beer was usually lower in alcohol than many modern varieties and could provide calories as well as liquid. Together, bread and beer supported daily labor, but they did not represent the full diet. Animal bones found in the settlement indicate the consumption of cattle, sheep, goats, and fish. Some cuts of meat suggest that high-status workers or specialists received better portions. This does not mean every laborer ate lavishly, nor that the workforce enjoyed equal treatment. Rations likely reflected rank, role, and availability. Yet the presence of substantial meat consumption shows that the state invested heavily in maintaining at least part of the labor force. A weakened, underfed crew could not quarry, haul, lift, and position stone with consistent precision. Cattle were especially expensive to raise because they required grazing land and significant agricultural resources. Supplying beef to Giza meant that royal estates, herders, transport officials, and slaughter teams were integrated into the project. The pyramid site drew calories from the countryside just as it drew stone from quarries. Its true footprint extended far beyond the plateau. Administrators made this possible. Ceilings, labels, pottery marks, and written records reveal a world of accounting. Deliveries were measured, storage spaces were controlled, crews had names and internal identities, officials tracked grain, beer, livestock, tools, and work assignments. The same state capable of surveying a pyramid base could also count loaves and record shipments. Monumentality depended on paperwork, even when most of that paperwork has vanished. Work gangs were often divided into smaller units with names that expressed loyalty to the king or group identity. Graffiti preserved within the pyramid complex record crew designations, reminding us that the workers did not experience themselves only as an anonymous mass. Teams competed, coordinated, and took pride in completing assigned sections. Such organization helped divide a seemingly impossible project into manageable tasks. Craftspeople occupied another layer of the settlement. Copper tools required sharpening and repair. Wooden sledges, levers, boats, and structural supports needed carpenters. Rope makers twisted plant fibers into lines strong enough for hauling. Potters produced vessels for food, water, beer, oil, and storage. Stoneworkers shaped blocks and architectural elements. Scribes moved between workshops, storehouses, and supervisors, turning physical labor into recorded quantities. The harbor's copper contamination fits naturally into this world. Metal particles in the mud were the chemical shadow of workshops somewhere nearby. Copper was valuable and repeatedly recycled. A damaged tool was not simply discarded, It could be reheated, hammered, recast, or reshaped. The settlement therefore functioned not only as a place of consumption, but as a repair system that kept construction moving. Evidence of injuries and healed bones from cemeteries associated with workers suggests that some received care after accidents. Heavy labour inevitably caused trauma, falls, crushed limbs, muscle strain, and chronic wear were risks even without dramatic catastrophe. The fact that certain individuals survived serious injuries indicates access to food and support during recovery. The evidence remains incomplete, and it cannot reveal the experience of every worker, but it complicates the idea of a disposable labour force. The workforce was also socially varied. Senior officials and skilled specialists lived differently from rotating crews. Some residences were larger and better provisioned. Administrative compounds stood apart from simpler living areas. Hierarchy shaped space, diet, and authority. Giza was not an equal community gathered around a shared national dream. It was a royal project operating through the social divisions of the Old Kingdom. Even so, the settlement preserves a sense of collective effort. Thousands of tasks had to align. A delayed grain shipment affected bakers. A shortage of copper slowed tool repair. A blocked canal disrupted stone delivery. Sick animals reduced meat supplies. Poor accounting created confusion across work teams. The pyramid's smooth exterior concealed an unstable network in which small failures could spread quickly. This may be why the builder's city was positioned so close to the monument. Distance increased uncertainty. By concentrating labour, storage, repair, administration, and food production near the plateau, the state shortened the chain between command and action. Officials could respond to shortages, crews could be reassigned, tools could return to workshops and reappear on the site. The settlement acted as the nervous system of the construction landscape. Much of it eventually disappeared beneath sand, later occupation, and modern development. Its mud brick walls eroded far more quickly than limestone. For centuries, the pyramids survived while the community that supported them became nearly invisible. This imbalance shaped popular memory. Stone seemed eternal, and labour seemed anonymous. Yet the lower settlement changes the meaning of Giza. The pyramids were not built only by quarrymen dragging blocks. They were sustained by brewers, bakers, herders, boat crews, potters, scribes, carpenters, metalworkers, cooks, and administrators. The plateau was chosen because a complete working society could be assembled around it. Above, the king's monument reached toward the sky. Below, an organized city woke before dawn, lit its ovens, opened its stores, repaired its tools, and kept the mountain rising. By the time Khufu's pyramid dominated the northern plateau, Giza was no longer an open landscape waiting to be chosen. It had become a terrain of consequences. Quarries had cut away vast sections of limestone, roads crossed the plateau, cemeteries spread beside the Great Pyramid, a causeway descended toward the eastern lowlands, workshops, storage areas, and residential zones occupied the ground below. Any later king who wished to build at Giza had to negotiate with Khufu's monument, with the altered geology around it, and with the political meaning of placing another royal pyramid beside a structure already approaching the limits of human scale. Khafra's response was not to move far away. He selected ground southwest of the Great Pyramid and established a second complex close enough to form part of the same royal horizon. The decision turned Giza from the burial place of one extraordinary king into a dynastic landscape. Yet Khafra could not simply repeat Khufu's arrangement. The available plateau had changed, and the new monument had to compete visually with an older pyramid that was larger in both height and volume. Topography offered a solution. Khafra's pyramid stands on a naturally higher part of the plateau. Its base is elevated above Khufu's, allowing the later monument to appear almost equal in height from many viewpoints. The pyramid itself is smaller, but the land beneath it narrows the visual difference. Its sides were also built at a slightly steeper angle, reinforcing the impression of vertical power. From certain positions, especially from the east or southeast, Khafra's pyramid can even seem taller than the Great Pyramid, though careful measurement shows otherwise. This was not an optical trick in the modern sense, it was an intelligent use of terrain. Khafra's planners understood that monumentality depended on viewpoint as much as absolute dimensions. A king did not need to exceed Khufu block for block if the plateau could elevate his pyramid and give it a commanding silhouette. The natural rise became part of the architectural calculation, just as it had beneath Khufu's monument. But now it also served a dynastic problem: how to stand beside the greatest pyramid without appearing subordinate. The foundation reveals another compromise between geology and ambition. Khafra's builders cut parts of the pyramid base directly into the bedrock, while building up other sections with masonry. The plateau slopes, and creating a stable level surface required excavation on the higher side and construction on the lower side. Large bedrock cuts remain visible around parts of the monument. These are not merely construction scars. They show the builders balancing the pyramid across uneven ground rather than clearing the entire site to one uniform depth. The surrounding complex was equally shaped by what already existed. Khufu's main quarry occupied ground to the north and east of Khafra's pyramid zone. Earlier roads, cemeteries, and service areas limited some routes. Khafra's causeway descended southeastward toward the valley, rather than following the same alignment as Khufu's. Its path responded to the slope, the quarry landscape, and the need to reach a suitable low area near water access. The causeway appears almost to thread between natural and human-made obstacles. At its lower end, Khafra's Valley Temple and the nearby Sphinx complex formed one of the most impressive stone-built environments at Giza. Massive limestone and granite blocks created spaces that connected the high pyramid to the former waterscape below. Whether every part of this lower arrangement was planned simultaneously remains debated, but the complex clearly used the transition zone between plateau and floodplain with exceptional care. Ritual movement, royal display, and practical access converged there. The surviving casing near the summit of Khafra's pyramid preserves a glimpse of how the Giza plateau once looked. Fine limestone originally covered the entire structure, reflecting sunlight and concealing the rougher core. Khufu's pyramid had possessed the same brilliant outer skin, now almost completely lost. When both monuments were intact, they would have appeared less like weathered piles of exposed blocks and more like sharply defined surfaces rising from the pale plateau. Their relationship was visual and deliberate, even if scholars still debate how much coordination existed between successive reigns. Khafra's project also expanded the funerary population of Giza. Mastaba cemeteries, subsidiary structures, temples, roads, and service zones multiplied. The plateau became increasingly crowded with the tombs of royal relatives and high officials seeking proximity to the king. Burial near the pyramid linked individual status to royal eternity. The landscape of power extended outward in stone, creating an ordered social geography around the monarch. When Menkaure later established his pyramid farther southwest, the challenge became different again. The largest and most favourable northern ground had already been claimed. Quarrying and earlier monuments constrained the central plateau. Menkaure selected a more distant area where the land falls toward the south and west. His pyramid was far smaller than those of Khufu and Khafra, a difference that has encouraged speculation about declining resources, shorter reigns, changing religious priorities, or a deliberate shift in royal architecture. No single explanation fully accounts for the reduction in scale. Menkaure's monument still required immense labour and sophisticated planning. Its lower courses were partly faced with granite, an expensive material transported from Aswan, while fine limestone was intended for higher areas. The use of granite gave the lower pyramid a distinct visual and material character. Scale decreased, but investment in specialised stone remained significant. The smaller pyramid may also reflect the increasingly complex demands of the entire funerary complex. Temples, causeways, subsidiary pyramids, statues, ritual equipment, and long-term cult arrangements consumed resources beyond the main monument. Royal commemoration was never measured only by pyramid volume. Menkaure's valley temple and mortuary structures underwent changes during construction, including the use of mud brick where stone may originally have been planned. These alterations suggest pressure of time or resources, though the exact circumstances remain uncertain. His causeway descended eastward toward another low-lying zone associated with water access and settlement activity. Once again, the architecture linked high desert burial to the riverine world below. But by Menkaure's reign, the plateau's logistical network had to serve several royal complexes at once. Older causeways remained significant. Priests maintained established cults. Cemeteries continued to expand. The new project entered a landscape already burdened with maintenance, memory, and competing claims. The three pyramids therefore should not be understood as identical monuments arranged according to one perfectly preserved master plan. They are the results of successive decisions. Khufu claimed the strongest northern position and created the dominant structure. Khafra used higher ground, a steeper profile, and a powerful lower complex to establish visual equivalence. Menkaure accepted a smaller scale, but introduced distinctive materials and completed the royal sequence farther south. Together, they transformed the plateau into something greater than any individual complex. Their differing positions created the diagonal rhythm now recognized around the world. From the eastern valley, the monuments appeared as a rising sequence against the desert horizon. From elsewhere, they overlapped, separated, or exchanged visual dominance as the observer moved. The landscape did not present one fixed composition. It changed with approach. What survives in the record suggests that each reign inherited both opportunities and restrictions from the one before it. A quarry became a route or obstacle. A natural rise became a foundation. An earlier causeway influenced later access. A royal cemetery narrowed available space while increasing the sacred importance of building nearby. Giza grew through adaptation rather than simple repetition. By the end of Menkaure's project, the plateau had become an engineered dynastic world. 3 artificial mountains occupied different elevations. Their temples reached toward vanished waterways. Their cemeteries reproduced the hierarchy of the court. Their quarries and roads recorded decades of extraction and movement. The site originally chosen for its open space was now defined by density. The greatness of Giza lies partly in this accumulation. One king's monument would have been extraordinary. 3 successive royal complexes turned the plateau into a statement about continuity, rivalry, and inherited power. Each pyramid stands alone, yet each also depends on the others for the landscape remembered today. The rulers did not merely occupy Giza. Across generations, they argued with it, adjusted to it, and reshaped it until the natural plateau could no longer be separated from the dynasty that claimed its horizon. South of Khufu's causeway and below the higher ground chosen for Khafra's pyramid, the plateau descends into one of Giza's most unusual geological spaces. Here, the builders did not raise a monument block by block. They removed the surrounding rock until a colossal figure remained. The Great Sphinx is often treated as an isolated mystery, a creature placed beside the pyramids for reasons that history failed to record. Yet its position makes more sense when it is seen as part of the same landscape logic that shaped the entire plateau. The Sphinx exists where quarrying, geology, access, and royal symbolism converged. Its body was carved directly from the limestone bedrock. Workers cut down around a natural mass, creating the enclosure that surrounds the monument and leaving the central ridge to be shaped into a recumbent lion with a human head. The stone removed from that enclosure did not simply become waste. Large blocks from the excavation were used in nearby architecture, especially in the Sphinx temple and possibly other structures within Khafra's lower complex. The carving of the statue and the construction of the surrounding temples were therefore linked materially. One space was hollowed out while another rose beside it. This method explains why the Sphinx stands lower than the main pyramids. It was not intended to compete with them in elevation. It occupied the transition zone between the plateau and the ancient floodplain, near the lower end of Khafra's causeway and valley complex. From the east, the figure faced the rising sun and the former waterscape beyond. Behind it, the causeway climbed toward Khafra's pyramid. The Sphinx stood between river and royal tomb, lowland and high desert, sunrise and the western cemetery. The geology dictated much of its form. The body crosses several limestone layers of different quality. Harder beds form more resistant sections, while softer layers have suffered greater erosion and required repeated repair. The head, carved from denser stone, has survived better than much of the elongated body beneath it. This contrast has encouraged speculation that the head and body were created at different times, but differences in weathering can largely be explained by the geology itself. Softer stone erodes faster, even when carved during the same project. The builders had to work with the natural shape of the remaining rock mass. The proportions of the body may partly reflect what the quarry left available, rather than an ideal sculptural plan drawn without constraint. The Sphinx's body is unusually long in relation to its head, and its back follows the layered bedrock. This does not necessarily indicate incompetence or later alteration. It may reveal how monumental carving proceeds when the stone itself sets limits. The workers could remove material, but they could not add a new geological layer where nature had failed to provide one. The enclosure walls preserve the same beds visible in the monument. Their alternating hard and soft bands make the Sphinx appear almost as though it is still emerging from the plateau. In a literal sense, it is. The statue is not a separate object placed in a prepared courtyard. It is a surviving part of the original ground, surrounded by the void created through quarrying. As with the pyramids, Giza's architecture involved reorganizing the plateau's mass. But here the transformation was subtractive rather than additive. The date and patronage of the Sphinx have been debated for generations. The mainstream archaeological interpretation associates it with Khafra's complex, based on its location, architectural relationships, quarry sequence, and the style of the surrounding monuments. The causeway passes beside the enclosure, and blocks cut from the area appear to have been used in temples linked to Khafra. No surviving inscription from the original construction explicitly states that Khafra ordered the statue, so complete certainty remains impossible. Alternative proposals connect it to Khufu or another ruler, but the strongest contextual case still places it within the 4th dynasty and most likely within Khafra's reign. Its identity is equally uncertain. The face may represent a king, probably Khafre under the conventional interpretation, but erosion and later damage make direct portrait comparison difficult. The royal headcloth and human face clearly connect the monument to kingship. The lion's body conveyed power, protection, and dominance over the desert edge. By joining human intelligence and royal identity with the strength of a lion, the statue created an image suited to guarding a sacred approach. The Sphinx's eastern orientation is significant. It faces the point where the sun rises over the Nile Valley. At certain times of year, sunlight travels along alignments within the broader complex, though claims of exact astronomical programming should be treated cautiously. The basic symbolism is already powerful without requiring a hidden code. A royal guardian looking toward dawn could embody renewal, solar power, and the king's enduring presence at the boundary of the necropolis. Later Egyptians understood the figure through solar language. During the New Kingdom, more than 1,000 years after its creation, the Sphinx was associated with the sun god Horemheb, the falcon in the horizon. A royal stela erected between its paws described how the young prince Thutmose encountered the monument partly buried in sand and later cleared it after becoming king. This text reflects the Sphinx's later religious life rather than proving its original name or meaning, but it shows how naturally the figure became connected to horizon symbolism. Its placement made such reinterpretation almost inevitable. The Sphinx looked east across the lowlands while the pyramids rose behind it in the west. At dawn, the light approached its face before climbing toward the higher monuments. At sunset, the pyramids stood against the dying light while the Sphinx remained turned toward the place of return. It occupied a landscape built around cycles river flood and recession, sunrise and sunset, life in the valley and burial in the desert. The monument may also have marked an entrance. Visitors, officials, priests, and processions approaching Khafra's lower complex would encounter the Sphinx near the route upward. Its scale transformed the passage from harbour zone to pyramid causeway into a controlled sacred threshold. The lion did not need to block the road physically. Its presence declared that movement into the royal landscape occurred under the king's authority. The quarry context made this symbolism economically possible. Creating a freestanding statue of comparable size from transported blocks would have required enormous additional labour. At Giza, a suitable bedrock mass already stood near an important architectural route. Quarrying was necessary for the temple complex, and the remaining stone could be turned into a monument. Practical opportunity and sacred meaning reinforced one another, as they had in the choice of the plateau itself. Yet the same geological opportunity created lasting problems. The softer body layers began weathering early. Repairs were made in ancient times, with masonry added to protect weakened surfaces. Sand repeatedly filled the enclosure, sometimes preserving the lower sections while burying the monument almost to the neck. Rainfall, groundwater, salt, wind, and temperature changes continued to affect the limestone. The Sphinx survived not because it was untouched, but because generations repeatedly intervened. Its weathering has also fueled claims that it must be far older than the pyramids, perhaps carved during a wetter prehistoric period. These arguments focus on erosion patterns in the enclosure and propose heavy rainfall as the primary cause. Most archaeologists and geologists do not accept that this proves a date thousands of years earlier than the 4th dynasty. Water erosion can result from several processes, including runoff, moisture movement, and rainfall occurring over long periods after construction. The archaeological context remains more consistent with Old Kingdom creation. The evidence does not support claims of a lost advanced civilization at Giza in remote prehistory. The real history is extraordinary without such additions. Ancient builders recognized that a quarry beside a royal causeway could become something more than an excavation. They shaped the leftover rock into a guardian whose body remained physically attached to the plateau. They placed it where boats, temples, desert, and pyramid routes met. They allowed geology to determine part of its anatomy and symbolism to determine its gaze. The Sphinx therefore belongs to the answer of why Giza was chosen. The plateau offered not only foundations and building stone but sculptural possibilities on a monumental scale. Its terraces could carry pyramids, its quarries could feed construction. One surviving ridge could become a lion facing the dawn. At Giza, even the spaces created by removing stone could be turned into royal architecture, until the landscape itself seemed to watch over the monuments rising from its body. The finished monuments encourage an illusion of absolute control. Their sides rise in disciplined planes. Their bases follow measured lines. Their position on the plateau appears calm, deliberate, and permanent. Yet beneath that image lies a far less orderly reality. Giza was never a flawless block of stone waiting for geometry. It was a fractured, weathering, uneven geological surface, and the builders had to work around weaknesses that could not always be seen from above. Limestone is strong in compression, which makes it suitable for carrying enormous weight, but it is not uniform. The plateau contains bedding planes, joints, fissures, softer bands, fossil-rich layers, cavities, and zones weakened by erosion. Some fractures developed when the rock was uplifted and stressed over geological time. Others widened as temperature changes, salts, moisture, and gravity acted upon the stone. A foundation could appear sound at the surface while concealing a weaker seam below. The builders reduced this risk through observation and excavation. Exposed quarry faces allowed them to study how the limestone broke. Foundation cuts revealed changes in color, texture, and hardness. Weak material could be removed and replaced with masonry. Natural depressions could be filled or bypassed. The broad bases of the pyramids spread their loads over large areas, reducing pressure on any single point. Even so, the size of the monuments meant that small geological differences mattered. Khufu's builders selected one of the strongest and broadest parts of the northern plateau, but they still encountered irregular ground. The surviving bedrock around the Great Pyramid shows cut channels, prepared strips, and areas where natural stone was retained. The base was not founded on a single polished slab. It was assembled across rock that has been carefully corrected until the perimeter behaved as a unified platform. Where masonry met bedrock, the lowest courses had to accommodate variations without allowing the monument's visible geometry to drift. The interior bedrock mound added another uncertainty. Leaving natural stone beneath the central mass saved labor and improved direct support. But it also meant that part of the pyramid's hidden core could not be built course by course in the same way as the outer zones. Surveyors had to infer the shape of the remaining rock and integrate it into the rising masonry. The evidence remains incomplete because the monument conceals most of that interface. The builder's success is visible, but the exact sequence of correction and filling is not. Khafra's site presented a different challenge. Its higher elevation improved the monument's appearance, yet the ground sloped more noticeably. Large sections had to be cut into the plateau, while other sections required built support. Around the pyramid, dramatic bedrock faces reveal how much natural terrain was removed. This created a stable platform, but it also exposed fractured limestone and opened pathways for later weathering. Menkaur's location farther south occupied another geological setting, where lower ground and existing modifications limited the available choices. His complex required its own adjustments and changes during construction. The use of granite casing on the lower pyramid introduced a material far stronger than the local limestone, but that strength did not remove the need for a stable foundation beneath it. Heavy, closely fitted granite blocks could only perform properly if the supporting core and ground remained reliable. The plateau's cavities have long attracted speculation. Limestone landscapes can contain natural voids formed by dissolution, fractures, and ancient water movement, tomb shafts, quarry cuts, tunnels, and chambers added human-made spaces to the subsurface. Modern surveys have detected anomalies beneath parts of Giza, but an anomaly is not automatically a hidden city, a forgotten machine, or an enormous chamber. It may represent a change in rock density, a filled cut, a natural fissure, a known tomb, or disturbed ground. No credible evidence supports claims of vast structures descending kilometers beneath the plateau. The real subsurface is complicated enough. Ancient builders cut chambers into bedrock, carved shafts for burials, opened quarries, and later filled some spaces with rubble. Generations of tomb construction created overlapping voids around the royal complexes. Sand and debris concealed entrances. Collapse transformed open passages into irregular cavities. What appears on a modern instrument as a mysterious break in the stone may be the accumulated result of ordinary ancient activity. Water created another source of weakness. Giza stands above the normal floodplain, but the plateau is not untouched by moisture. Rare heavy rain can move rapidly across hard desert surfaces and descend through cracks or low channels. Water entering porous limestone carries dissolved salts. When the stone later dries, those salts crystallize and expand, breaking down the surface grain by grain. Moisture can also rise from lower ground, especially where modern urban growth, irrigation, leaking pipes, and changing groundwater conditions alter the ancient environment. The Sphinx enclosure demonstrates how destructive these processes can be. Its softer beds eroded deeply, while harder layers projected outward. Masonry repairs were added in multiple periods to protect the body. The same pattern appears elsewhere in less dramatic form. Tomb walls flake, quarry faces retreat, foundation stones lose sharp edges. The plateau is stable on a human scale, but it is not motionless. Wind and sand also leave marks, though not always in the way popular imagination suggests. Wind-driven particles abrade exposed surfaces, especially where softer limestone has already weakened. Sand can bury architecture and reduce direct erosion for centuries. Then removal exposes the stone again. The monuments pass through repeated cycles of burial, clearance, repair, reuse, and neglect. Their survival reflects changing conditions, not uninterrupted preservation. Earth movement is another concern. Though Giza is not positioned in one of the world's most violent seismic zones, regional earthquakes have affected Egyptian monuments across history. Vibrations can exploit existing cracks, loosen blocks, and damage repaired surfaces. The massive pyramids are inherently stable because of their broad bases and inward-sloping form, but smaller structures, temples, casing stones, and fractured bedrock are more vulnerable. Stones removed in later periods also changed how remaining masonry carried loads. Human intervention often caused more visible damage than geology. Fine casing blocks were stripped for reuse in Cairo and elsewhere. Temple stones were quarried from monuments already standing. Tombs were opened, recut, and occupied. explorers forced passages. Modern tourism introduced vibration, humidity, pollution, and constant physical pressure. Giza's landscape has never stopped being used. The plateau's apparent perfection also conceals unfinished work. Quarry faces end abruptly. Some casing stones were left rough. Menkaur's granite blocks preserve areas where final smoothing was never completed. Construction plans changed, and certain elements were simplified or finished in different materials. These details do not diminish the achievement. They reveal that the site was governed by time, resources, royal deaths, stone quality, and practical decisions. Scholars still debate how builders responded to every weakness. They may have adjusted pyramid positions after preliminary quarrying revealed poor beds. Some visible asymmetries may reflect geological obstacles rather than surveying error. Certain roads and causeways may follow routes chosen to avoid unstable ground. Because later construction erased many temporary works, the process must be reconstructed from what remains. This uncertainty is important. Giza was not selected because it was geologically perfect. It was selected because its flaws could be managed within the capabilities of experienced builders. Strong beds were extensive enough to support the main monuments. Weak zones could be cut away, filled, faced, or avoided. Local stone remained plentiful despite variations in quality. Elevation protected the plateau from regular flooding, even though rare water and long-term weathering continued to affect it. The success of Giza therefore lies not in the absence of risk, but in the ability to recognize and control it. The builders worked with imperfect rock, changing water levels, fragile surfaces, and uncertain subsurface conditions. They created forms that appear eternal from materials that were always slowly breaking down. The monuments endure because their design distributed weight intelligently, and because generations repeatedly repaired what nature weakened. Beneath the straight lines, Giza remains a landscape of cracks. Its foundations are crossed by ancient seams. Its statues weather according to layers formed in a vanished sea. Its quarries expose the uneven body of the plateau. The perfection belongs to the geometry. The survival belongs to constant negotiation between that geometry and the restless stone beneath it. By this point, the reasons for choosing Giza seem almost to arrange themselves into a convincing answer. The plateau was high, dry, broad, and visible. Its limestone could support immense weight and supply much of the core masonry. Waterways approached the desert edge. Memphis lay close enough for administration, labor, and supplies to be directed toward the site. The western horizon carried funerary meaning, and the open sky allowed precise orientation. Yet the closer each factor is examined, the more difficult it becomes to name one as the decisive cause. Giza was not chosen because it solved a single problem better than every other place. It was chosen because many different advantages overlapped there strongly enough to outweigh its imperfections. Geology provides the most immediate foundation for the argument. Without stable bedrock, everything else becomes irrelevant. A royal court could possess boats, labor, and religious ambition, but a weak or deeply unstable site could not carry a monument of Khufu's scale. Giza offered extensive limestone beds strong enough to support the Great Pyramid and broad enough for surrounding temples and cemeteries. The plateau also permitted parts of the natural rock to be incorporated into the foundations and lower mass of the monuments. But geology alone cannot explain the decision. Other parts of the Memphite desert contained limestone. Saqqara, Dashur, Abu Rawash, and later Abu Sir all supported large royal monuments. Some areas may have offered stone of comparable or even better quality in particular beds. Giza's rock was useful, not unique. Its value emerged because the stone existed beside other advantages. The nearby quarry was one of those advantages. Most of the core limestone did not need to travel from distant sources. The plateau could be dismantled locally and rebuilt as a pyramid. This dramatically reduced the burden of transport, especially for the countless blocks that did not require fine surface quality. The Great Pyramid's quarry demonstrates that royal planners understood the economic importance of placing the monument near its material. Still, local stone was not enough. The finest casing limestone came from Tura, granite came from Aswan, timber, copper, food, and specialized goods came from landscapes scattered across Egypt and beyond. A site with excellent local stone but poor external access would have trapped the project within its own quarry. Giza succeeded because the Nile connected local abundance to distant resources. Transport therefore competes with geology as the central explanation. The vanished Ahramat Branch and the Giza Inlet place the plateau much closer to navigable water than the modern landscape suggests. Harbours and basins allowed boats to deliver heavy cargo toward the foot of the escarpment. The Diary of Mera confirms that fine limestone moved by water to Khufu's project. Sediment cores and copper contamination show that the lower waterscape was not theoretical. It was active, managed, and closely tied to construction. Yet water access was common along the Nile. Many locations stood near channels or could be reached through canals. Giza's harbour system mattered because the water approached a plateau that also possessed height, stone, and proximity to the centre of government. A harbour without a suitable foundation would not produce a pyramid field. A foundation without a harbour would make the project far more expensive. Neither condition fully explains the site alone. Politics brings another layer. Giza lay within the wider royal cemetery of Memphis, near the kingdom's administrative heart. From this region, officials could organize labor, collect grain, manage fleets, assign estates, and monitor deliveries. The site was connected to the institutions that made large-scale construction possible. A pyramid was not raised by stoneworkers alone. It depended on taxation, accounting, agricultural surplus, transport orders, and the authority to concentrate resources for decades. Khufu's move to Giza may also have served dynastic ambition. Sneferu had already filled the southern Memphite horizon with enormous monuments. By selecting a new plateau farther north, Khufu could establish a field dominated by his own name rather than stand within the immediate shadow of his father's projects. Giza offered continuity with the western royal cemeteries, while allowing visual and political separation. That explanation remains plausible, but motive is difficult to prove. No surviving decree records Khufu's reasoning. He may have been influenced by quarry quality, water access, ritual geography, political rivalry, or all of them together. Scholars reconstruct decisions from landscapes and monuments, but landscapes do not preserve every conversation held in a royal court. Religion is equally important and equally resistant to simplification. The Western Desert was associated with sunset and burial. The pyramid's eastern side faced the river valley and the rising sun, while its western side opened toward the realm of the dead. The monument's orientation placed it within the ordered movement of the sky. Royal afterlife beliefs, solar symbolism, the imperishable northern stars, and the concept of cosmic order all shaped Old Kingdom architecture. Some interpretations go further, proposing deliberate sightlines toward Heliopolis or geometric alignments, linking the Giza pyramids with sacred centers. Such patterns may reflect intentional planning, but they remain debated. A line drawn between monuments can be real without revealing why it mattered. The builders may have considered visual relationships that are no longer recoverable, yet it is risky to convert every alignment into a proven religious program. Astronomy presents the same difficulty. The remarkable cardinal orientation of Khufu's and Khafra's pyramids indicates careful observation of the sky. The plateau's open horizon made solar or stellar surveying easier, but precise orientation explains how the monuments were laid out, not necessarily why the site was selected in the first place. Surveyors could orient buildings at other pyramid fields. Giza's horizon was favourable, but it was part of a larger package. Visibility may have mattered more than modern discussion sometimes acknowledge. From the floodplain and waterways, the pyramids would have dominated the western skyline. Their elevated position increased their apparent height. Their casing reflected sunlight. The monuments could be seen by people travelling toward Memphis, working in fields, or moving along river channels. Royal power was therefore embedded in everyday movement through the landscape. A monument seen from a distance works differently from one hidden behind hills or deep within the desert. Giza announced itself. Khufu's pyramid transformed the horizon into a political surface. Khafra then used slightly higher ground to compete visually, and Menkaure completed the sequence farther south. Visibility helped turn separate funerary complexes into a dynastic image. But visibility carries a practical cost. Highly exposed monuments are vulnerable to wind, temperature changes, later stone removal, and public access. A hidden site might have offered greater protection. The kings of the Fourth Dynasty appear to have preferred proclamation over concealment. Their burial architecture was designed to be recognized, approached, serviced, and remembered. Another explanation concerns available space. Giza's broad plateau allowed Khufu to establish a vast complex with subsidiary pyramids, mastaba cemeteries, temples, roads, quarries, and service areas. It also permitted Khafra and Menkaure to build nearby. Yet this later expansion should not be assumed to have been fully planned from the beginning. The famous three-pyramid arrangement may be the accumulated result of successive royal choices rather than one original master design. No single explanation fully accounts for this sequence because each factor solves a different part of the problem. Geology explains support, quarrying explains local material, water explains long-distance movement, Memphis explains administration, religion explains sacred placement, astronomy explains orientation, visibility explains royal display, dynastic succession explains why later kings remained nearby despite increasing constraints. The strongest answer is therefore not a ranking, but a system. Giza was valuable because these elements reinforced one another. The plateau rose high enough to remain dry, but not so far from the river that transport became impossible. Its limestone was strong enough for foundations and abundant enough for quarrying. Its proximity to Memphis connected it to state power. Its western location suited burial traditions. Its horizon allowed both precise surveying and monumental visibility. If one element had been missing, the decision might have changed. Weak stone could have defeated ambition. A distant river could have multiplied labour. Political isolation could have disrupted supply. A cramped plateau could have limited the complex. Giza was not perfect in every category, but it was unusually strong across all of them at once. That is why the search for one secret reason repeatedly fails. There was no isolated geological miracle, no single sacred alignment, no lost river that explains everything, and no purely political command sufficient by itself. Giza was chosen because the landscape allowed practical necessity and royal meaning to occupy the same ground. Stone, water, power, death, and horizon met there. and together they made an artificial mountain seem possible. The landscape that began as a limestone margin above a shifting river had, by the end of the 4th dynasty, become something no earlier generation could have fully imagined. The plateau was no longer simply a place where monuments stood. It had been reorganized into an immense machine of memory: quarries, causeways, temples, harbours, settlements, cemeteries, and 3 royal pyramids formed a single engineered environment in which every level of the terrain carried a different purpose. The river delivered life and material below. The plateau held the dead above. Between them, roads and processional routes converted movement into ritual and labour into permanence. Khufu's builders began by claiming the northern rise, but their work extended far beyond the pyramid's base. They cut stone from the plateau, leaving depressions that shaped later routes. They established a harbour approach in the lowlands. They created storage and working zones, prepared cemeteries, and imposed cardinal order on irregular rock. The Great Pyramid became the dominant point in a landscape whose every part now referred back to the king. Khufu inherited that transformed world and made it more complex. His pyramid used higher ground to compete visually with Khufu's. His causeway crossed a terrain already altered by quarrying. His lower complex occupied the boundary where the plateau dropped toward the ancient waterscape. The Sphinx emerged from the same geological body, turning a leftover ridge of stone into a royal guardian. Architecture no longer merely occupied the landscape. It controlled how the landscape was approached, seen, and understood. Menkaure added another royal axis farther south. His smaller pyramid did not diminish the plateau's significance. It completed a sequence. From different viewpoints, the 3 monuments formed changing relationships, sometimes separated, sometimes overlapping, sometimes rising in a diagonal procession against the western sky. Their arrangement was not necessarily the product of one original plan, but the accumulated result was more powerful than a single plan might have been. Successive rulers converted individual funerary projects into a dynastic horizon. This horizon depended on labour that was largely erased from view. The finished monuments conceal the quarrymen who read bedding planes, the boat crews who navigated changing channels, the bakers who fed work gangs, the metal workers whose copper left faint contamination in harbour mud, and the scribes who turned deliveries into numbers. Their settlement walls crumbled, their wooden tools decayed, their boats disappeared, yet the pyramids preserved the consequences of their coordination in every course of stone. One of Giza's most surprising lessons is that monumentality did not come from ignoring nature. It came from understanding how to use nature selectively. The builders preserved a bedrock mound beneath Khufu's pyramid. They used elevation to amplify Khufu's monument. They followed local limestone beds to supply the cause. They placed harbours where water approached the plateau. They cut causeways along manageable slopes. They turned a quarry ridge into the Sphinx. Human intention remained dominant, but it succeeded through constant negotiation with geology, water, and terrain. The result was a landscape designed to operate across several scales at once. At the scale of the worker, Giza was a place of tools, ramps, boats, meals, and repeated physical effort. At the scale of administration, it was a network of estates, crews, accounts, and supply routes. At the scale of the king, it was a monument to dynastic power. At the scale of religion, it joined east and west, sunrise and burial, river and desert. At the scale of the horizon, it became an image visible from far beyond the construction site. The waterways eventually changed. The western branch of the Nile became shallower, migrated, and disappeared beneath silt, cultivation, and urban growth. Harbours lost their function, basins filled, routes that once carried boats became buried ground. The support city declined, and the living machinery around the pyramids faded. This environmental change did not destroy the monuments, but it severed them from the landscape that had made them practical. That separation altered memory. Later visitors encountered enormous structures standing above dry land, and found it increasingly difficult to imagine ships reaching the foot of the plateau. The disappearance of water made transport seem more mysterious. The erosion of mud brick settlements made the workforce seem absent. The removal of casing stones made the pyramids appear rough and unfinished. The loss of temples and harbour installations isolated the surviving forms from the system to which they once belonged. Modern archaeology has slowly restored those connections. Sediment cores reveal vanished channels. Radar imagery traces buried river courses. Quarry studies identify where core stone originated. Geological analysis explains why some beds carried weight better than others. The Diary of Mera gives a human voice to waterborne transport. Copper in ancient mud records the presence of working metal. None of these discoveries diminishes the achievement. They make it more comprehensible and, in many ways, more impressive. The builders did not rely on one impossible technique. They created a system in which many ordinary capabilities were organized at extraordinary scale. Boats moved cargo, sledges crossed prepared surfaces, crews divided tasks, surveyors repeated observations, quarries shortened transport distances, food production kept labour functioning, state authority coordinated resources over years. The wonder lies less in a lost secret than in the integration of all these parts. Giza's legacy also extends beyond engineering. The plateau became the image through which much of the world imagines ancient Egypt. Other royal cemeteries contain longer sequences, more varied architecture, and crucial evidence for the development of kingship. Yet Giza's three great pyramids, elevated above the valley and arranged across open desert, created a visual language of endurance that later ages could not ignore. That endurance is partly accidental. The pyramids survived because their mass was difficult to dismantle completely, because their broad forms resisted collapse, and because the desert climate slowed some kinds of decay. Temples, houses, harbours, and administrative buildings were less fortunate. What remains is therefore not a complete picture of what mattered most to the builders. It is a survival pattern shaped by material. Stone outlasted mud brick. Foundations outlasted boats. Royal names outlasted most of the people who served them. Even the pyramids have changed. Their casing was stripped. Their entrances were opened. Their surrounding cemeteries were disturbed. Modern roads, tourism, pollution, groundwater, and expanding neighbourhoods now press against the ancient site. Giza still occupies a boundary, but the worlds on either side have changed. The fertile valley has become part of a vast urban region. The desert is crossed by infrastructure. The ancient river branch is gone. Yet the plateau continues to express the logic of its selection. It still rises above lower ground. Its bedrock still carries the monuments. The quarry scars remain beside the stone they supplied. The causeways still descend toward places where water once approached. The Sphinx still faces east. The pyramids still hold their cardinal alignment beneath a sky that has shifted only slightly in 4.5 millennia. This is why Giza was chosen, and why the choice still matters. The site allowed the Egyptians to bind the practical world to the imagined one. Limestone became both resource and symbol. The river became both transport route and boundary of life. The western desert became both dry foundation and realm of the dead. State administration became sacred architecture. A working landscape became an eternal one. No single element would have created Giza alone. The genius of the site lay in convergence. Stone, water, labour, government, visibility, and belief met within a narrow zone at the edge of the Nile Valley. The builders recognized that convergence and intensified it. They did not merely place monuments in a favorable location. They engineered the entire setting until the plateau itself became part of the royal message. And now, as the light begins to soften across the western desert, the modern noise below seems to recede. The pyramids remain where the ancient surveyors fixed them, their edges worn, their casing mostly gone, their internal chambers silent. The river that once approached them has moved away, but the causeways still remember its direction. The quarries remain open wounds in the limestone, but their missing stone still rises above them. It is easy to think of history as a sequence of names and reigns, yet Giza suggests another way of remembering. History can also survive in the relationship between ground and structure, between a buried channel and a road descending toward it, between a harbour's vanished water and a trace of copper held in mud. Memory does not always preserve the people themselves. Sometimes it preserves the roots they created, the surfaces they levelled, and the weight they taught the earth to carry. The workers are gone. The officials who counted deliveries are gone. The boats have rotted, the grain has vanished, and the voices that once filled the lower settlement have been silent for thousands of years. But the system they built has not disappeared completely. It remains encoded in the distances between monuments, in the orientation of walls, in the geology of foundations, and in the slow descent from pyramid to valley. Seen this way, the plateau is not empty, it is crowded with absence. Every open quarry marks stone removed by human hands. Every buried basin marks water that once moved through the site. Every broken temple wall marks a route that once carried offerings, cargo, or ceremony. The silence is not the silence of a place untouched. It is the silence left after an entire working world has passed. The pyramids endure, but even they are temporary on the scale of the limestone beneath them. Wind will continue to soften edges, cracks will widen, human beings will repair, study, protect, and sometimes misunderstand them. The horizon will remain familiar for a while longer, though no monument is truly beyond time. For now, however, the three great forms still rise above the western edge of the valley. The sun lowers behind them as it did before the first foundation trench was cut. Their shadows extend across the plateau, passing over quarries, tombs, roads, and the sleeping stone of the Sphinx. Far below, beneath streets and fields, the old river landscape lies buried, and in that meeting of shadow, stone, and forgotten water, Giza still reveals the reason it was chosen. It was a place where the earth could be transformed without losing its own power, where a kingdom could gather its resources, where a river could deliver a mountain, and where human memory could be fixed, however briefly, against the movement of time.